Chapter 7: Evolutionists' Biased and Deceptive Fossil Interpretations. Before going into the details of the myth of human evolution, we need to mention the propaganda method that has convinced the general public of the idea that half man, half ape creatures once lived in the past. This propaganda method makes use of reconstructions made in reference to fossils. Reconstruction can be explained as drawing a picture or constructing a model of a living thing based on a single bone, sometimes only a fragment that has been unearthed. The ape men we see in newspapers, magazines, or films are all reconstructions. The fossils that are claimed to be evidence for the human evolution scenario are in fact products of fraud. For more than 150 years, not even a single fossil to prove evolution has been found. As a matter of fact, the reconstructions, drawings, or models made by the evolutionists are prepared speculatively, precisely to validate the evolutionary thesis. David R. Pilbeam, an anthropologist from Harvard, stresses this fact when he says, and quote, "At least in paleoanthropology, data are still so sparse that theory heavily influences interpretations. Theories have in the past clearly reflected our current ideologies instead of the actual data. Since people are highly affected by visual information, these reconstructions best serve the purpose of evolutionists, which is to convince people that these reconstructed creatures really existed in the past." At this point, we have to highlight one particular point. Reconstructions based on bone remains can only reveal the most general characteristics of the creature. Since the really distinctive morphological features of any animal are soft tissues which quickly vanish after death. Therefore, due to speculative nature of the interpretation of the soft tissues, the reconstructed drawings or models become totally dependent on the imagination of the person producing them. Ernest A. Houghton from Harvard University explains the situation like this. To attempt to restore the soft parts is an even more hazardous undertaking. The lips, the eyes, the ears, and the nasal tip leave no clues on the underlying bony parts. You can with equal facility model on a Neanderthalide skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. The alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public. So put your trust in reconstructions. So put not your trust in reconstructions. As a matter of fact, evolutionists invent such preposterous stories that even ascribe different faces to the same skull. For example, the 3 different reconstructed drawings made for the fossil named Australopithecus robustus, Zinjanthropus, are a famous example of such forgery. The biased interpretation of fossils and the outright fabrication of many imaginary reconstructions are an indication of how frequently evolutionists have recourse to tricks. Imaginary and deceptive drawings. In pictures and reconstructions, evolutionists deliberately give shape to features that do not actually leave any fossil traces, such as the structure of the nose and lips, the shape of the hair, the form of the eyebrows, and other bodily hair so as to support evolution. They also prepare detailed pictures depicting these imaginary creatures walking with their families, hunting, or in other instances of their daily lives. However, these drawings are all figments of the imagination and have no counterpart in the fossil record. 3 different reconstructions based on the same skull appeared in Sunday Times, April 5, 1964, and C. Maurice Wilson's drawing, and C. N. Parker's reconstruction, National Geographic, September 1960. All 3 had come with different drawings for same skull. The biased interpretation of fossils and outright fabrication of merely imaginary reconstructions are an indication of how frequently evolutionists have recourse to tricks. Yet these seem innocent when compared to the deliberate forgeries they have been perpetrated in the history of evolution. For example, two drawings of Java man, which are totally different from each other, provide a good example of how fantastically fossils are interpreted by evolutionists. On the left, you can see Morris Wilson's drawing From Ape to Adam, The Search for the Ancestry of Man, Herbert Wendt. And on the right, you can see Stephen Stanley's drawing, Human Origins. Chapter 8. Evolution Forgeries. There is no concrete fossil evidence to support the ape-man image, which is unceasingly promulgated by the media and evolutionist academic circles. With brushes in their hands, evolutionists produce imaginary creatures. Nevertheless, the fact that these drawings correspond to no matching fossils constitutes a serious problem for them. One of the interesting methods they employ to overcome this problem is to produce the fossils they cannot find. Piltdown Man, which may be the biggest scandal in the history of science, is a typical example of this method. Piltdown Man, an orangutan jaw and a human skull. In 1912, a well-known doctor and amateur paleoanthropologist named Charles Dawson came out with the assertion that he had found a jawbone and a cranial fragment in a pit in Piltdown, England. Even though the jawbone was more ape-like, the teeth and the skull were like a man's. These specimens were labeled the Piltdown Man. Alleged to be 5 lakh years old, they were displayed as an absolute proof of human evolution in several museums. For more than 40 years, many scientific articles were written on Piltdown Man. Many interpretations and drawings were made, and the fossil was presented as important evidence for human evolution. No fewer than 500 doctoral theses were written on the subject. While visiting the British Museum in 1921, leading American paleoanthropologist Henry Fairfield Osborn said, "We have to be reminded over and over again that nature is full of paradoxes," and proclaimed Piltdown a discovery of transcendent importance to the prehistory of man. In 1949, Kenneth Oakley from the British Museum's Paleontology department attempted to use fluorine testing, a new test used for determining the date of fossils. A trial was made on the fossil of the Piltdown Man. The result was astonishing. During the test, it was realized that the jawbone of Piltdown Man did not contain any fluorine. This indicated that it had been buried no more than a few years. The skull, which contained only a small amount of fluorine, showed that it was not older than a few thousand years old. The story of a hoax. The fossils are unearthed by Charles Dawson and given to Sir Arthur Smith Woodward. Pieces are reconstructed to form the famous skull. Based on the reconstructed skull, various drawings and sculptures are made. Numerous articles and commentaries are written. The original skull is demonstrated in the British Museum. After 40 years of its discovery, the Piltdown fossil is shown to be a hoax by a group of researchers. It was determined that the teeth in the jawbone belonging to an orangutan had been worn down artificially, and that the primitive tools discovered with the fossils were simple imitations that had been sharpened with steel implements. In a detailed analysis completed by Joseph Weiner, this forgery was revealed to the public in 1953. The skull belonged to a 500-year-old man, and the jawbone belonged to a recently deceased ape. The teeth had been specially arranged in a particular way and added to the jaw, and the molar surfaces were filled in order to resemble those of a man. Then all these pieces were stained with potassium dichromate to give them an old appearance. These stains begin to disappear when dipped in acid. Sir Wilfred Lee Gross Clark, who was in the team that uncovered the forgery, could not hide his astonishment at the situation and said, and quote, "The evidences of artificial aberration immediately sprang to the eye. Indeed, so obvious did they seem, it may be well asked, how was it they had escaped notice before?" In the wake of all this, Piltdown Man was hurriedly removed from the British Museum, where it had been displayed for more than 40 years. Nebraska Man, a pig's tooth. In 1922, Henry Fairfield Osborn, the director of the American Museum of Natural History, declared that he had found a fossil molar tooth belonging to the Pliocene period in western Nebraska, near Snake Brook. This tooth allegedly bore common characteristics of both man and ape. An extensive scientific debate began surrounding this fossil, which came to be called Nebraska man, in which some interpreted this tooth as belonging to Pithecanthropus erectus, while others claimed it was closer to human beings. Nebraska man was also immediately given a scientific name, Hesperopithecus heraldcochi. Many authorities gave Osborne their support. Based on this single tooth, reconstructions of the Nebraska man's head and body were drawn. Moreover, Nebraska man was even pictured along with his wife and children as a whole family in a natural setting. Imaginary drawing. The picture on the left was drawn on the basis of a single tooth, and it was published in the Illustrated London News magazine on July 24, 1922. However, the evolutionists were extremely disappointed when it was revealed that this tooth belonged neither to an ape-like creature nor to a man, but rather to an extinct pig species. All these scenarios were developed from just one tooth. Evolutionist circles place such faith in this ghost man that when a researcher named William Bryan opposed these biased conclusions, relying on a single tooth, he was harshly criticized. In 1927, other parts of the skeleton were also found. According to these newly discovered pieces, the tooth belonged neither to a man nor to an ape. It was realized that it belonged to an extinct species of wild American pig called Prosthenops. William Gregory entitled the article published in Science, in which he announced the truth: Hesperopithecus, apparently not an ape nor a man. Then all the drawings of Hesperopithecus heraldcochi and his family were hurriedly removed from evolutionary literature. Ota Benga, the African in the Cage. After Darwin advanced a claim with his book The Descent of Man that man evolved from ape-like living beings, he started to seek fossils to support this contention. However, some evolutionists believed that half-man, half-ape creatures were to be found not only in the fossil record, but also alive in various parts of the world. In the early 20th century, these pursuits for living transitional links led to unfortunate incidents, one of the cruelest of which is the story of a pygmy by the name of Ota Benga. Ota Benga was captured in 1904 by an evolutionist researcher in the Congo. In his own tongue, his name meant friend. He had a wife and 2 children, chained and caged like an animal. He was taken to the United States of America, where evolutionist scientists displayed him to the public in the St. Louis World Fair along with other ape species and introduced him as the closest transitional link to man. 2 years later, they took him to Bronx Zoo in New York, and there they exhibited him under the denomination of ancient ancestors of man, along with a few chimpanzees, a gorilla named Dina, and an orangutan called Dohung. Dr. William T. Hornaday, the zoo's evolutionist director, gave long speeches on how proud he was to have this exceptional transitional form in his zoo and treated caged Ota Benga as if he were an ordinary animal. Unable to bear the treatment he was subjected to, Ota Benga eventually committed suicide. Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, Ota Benga. These scandals demonstrate that evolutionist scientists do not hesitate to employ any kind of unscientific method to prove their theory. Bearing this point in mind, when we look at the other so-called evidence of the human evolution myth, we confront a similar situation. Here there are a fictional story and an army of volunteers ready to try everything to verify this story. Chapter 9. The Scenario of Human Evolution. In previous chapters, we saw that there are no mechanisms in nature to lead the living beings to evolve, and that living species came into existence not as a result of an evolutionary process, but rather emerged all of a sudden in their present perfect structure. That is, they were created individually. Therefore, it's obvious that human evolution too is a story that has never taken place. What then do the evolutionists propose as the basis for this story? This basis is the existence of plenty of fossils on which the evolutionists are able to build up imaginary interpretations. Throughout history, more than 6,000 ape species have lived, and most of them have become extinct. Today, only 120 ape species live on the earth. These approximately 6,000 ape species, most of which are extinct, constitute a rich source for the evolutionists. The evolutionists wrote the scenario of human evolution by arranging some of the skulls that suited their purpose in an order from the smallest to the biggest, and scattering the skulls of some extinct human races among them. According to this scenario, men and today's apes have common ancestors. These creatures evolved in time, and some of them became the apes of today, while another group that followed another branch of evolution became the men of today. However, all the paleontological, anatomical, and biological foundings have demonstrated that this claim of evolution is as fictitious and invalid as all others. No sound or real evidence has been put forward to prove that there is a relationship between man and ape, except forgeries, distortions, and misleading drawings and comments. The fossil record indicates to us that throughout history, men have been men and apes have been apes. Some of the fossils the evolutionists claim to be the ancestors of man belong to human races that lived until very recently, about 10,000 years ago, and then disappeared. Moreover, many human communities currently living have the same physical appearance and characteristics as these extinct human races, which the evolutionists claim to be the ancestors of man. All these are clear proof that man has never gone through an evolutionary process at any period in history. The most important of all is that there are numerous anatomical differences between apes and men, and none of them are of the kind to come into existence through an evolutionary process. Bipedality is one of them. As we will describe later on in detail, bipedality is peculiar to man, and it is one of the most important traits that distinguishes man from other animals. The imaginary family tree of man. The Darwinist claim holds that today's man evolved from some kind of ape-like creature. During this alleged evolutionary process, which is supposed to have started from 4 to 5 million years ago, it's claimed that there existed some transitional forms between today's man and his ancestors. According to this completely imaginary scenario, the following 4 basic categories are listed. Australopithecines, any of the various forms belonging to the genus Australopithecus. Second, Homo habilis. Third, Homo erectus. And fourth, Homo sapiens. Evolutionists call a genus to which the alleged ape-like ancestors of the man belonged Australopithecus, which means southern ape. Australopithecus, which is nothing but an old type of ape that has become extinct, is found in various different forms. Some of them are larger and strongly built, while others are smaller and delicate. Evolutionists classify the next stage of human evolution as the genus Homo, that is man. According to the evolutionist claim, the living things in the Homo series are more developed than Australopithecus, and not very much different from today's man. The man of our day, that is the species Homo sapiens, is said to have formed at the latest stage of the evolution of this genus Homo. Fossils like Java man, Pekin man, and Lucy, which appear in the media from time to time and are to be found in evolutionist publications and textbooks, are included in one of the 4 groups listed above. A single jawbone as a spark of inspiration. The first Ramapithecus fossil found a missing jaw composed of 2 parts on the right. The evolutionists daringly pictured Ramapithecus, his family, and the environment and they lived in by relying only on these jawbones. Each of these groupings is also assumed to branch into species and subspecies as the case may be. Some suggested transitional forms of the past, such as Ramapithecus, has to be excluded from the imaginary human family tree after it was realized that they were ordinary apes. By outlinking the links in the chain as Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens, the evolutionists imply that each of these types is the ancestor of the next. For example, Homo habilis is the ancestor of Homo erectus, Erectus is the ancestor of Homo sapiens, and so on. However, recent findings by paleoanthropologists have revealed that Australopithecines, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus existed in different parts of the world at the same time. Moreover, some of those humans classified as Homo erectus probably lived up until very recent times. In an article titled Latest Homo erectus of Java, Potential Contemporaneity with Homo sapiens in Southeast Asia, it was reported in the journal Science that Homo erectus fossils found in Java had mean ages of 27 plus minus 2 to 53.3 plus minus 4,000 years ago. And this raises the possibility that Homo erectus overlapped in time with anatomically modern humans, that is, Homo sapiens in Southeast Asia. Furthermore, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens sapiens, today's man, are clearly coexisted. This situation apparently indicates the invalidity of the claim that one is the ancestor of the other. Intrinsically, all findings and scientific research have revealed that the fossil record does not suggest an evolutionary process as evolutionists propose. The fossils which evolutionists claim to be the ancestors of human in fact belong either to different human races or else to species of ape. Then which fossils are human and which ones are apes? Is it ever possible for any of them to be considered a transitional form? In order to find the answers, let us have a closer look at each category. Australopithecus, an ape species. The first category, the genus Australopithecus, means southern ape, as we have said. It is assumed that these creatures first appeared in Africa about 4 million years ago and lived until 1 million years ago. There are a number of different species among the Australopithecines. Evolutionists assume that the oldest Australopithecus species is Australopithecus afarensis. After that comes Australopithecus africanus and then Australopithecus robustus, which has relatively bigger bones. As for Australopithecus boisei, some researchers accept it as a different species and others as a subspecies of Australopithecus robustus. All of the Australopithecus species are extinct apes that resemble the apes of today. Their cranial capacities are the same or smaller than the chimpanzees of our day. There are projecting parts in their hands and feet which they use to climb trees, just like today's chimpanzees. And their feet are built for grasping to hold on to branches. They are short, maximum 120 centimeter, and just like today's chimpanzees. Male Australopithecus is larger than the female. Many other characteristics such as the details in their skulls, the closeness of their eyes, their sharp molar teeth, their mandibular structure, their long arms, and their short legs constitute evidence that these creatures were no different from today's ape. However, evolutionists claim that all the Australopithecines have the anatomy of apes. Like apes, they walked upright like humans. This claim that Australopithecines walked upright is a view that has been held by paleoanthropologists such as Richard Leakey and Donald C. Johanson for decades. Yet many scientists who have carried out a great deal of research on the skeletal structures of Australopithecines have proved the invalidity of that argument. Extensive research done on various Australopithecus specimens by two world-renowned anatomists from England and the United States of America, Lord Solly Zuckerman and Professor Charles Oxnard, showed that these creatures did not walk upright in human manner. Having studied the bones of these fossils for a period of 15 years thanks to grants from the British government, Lord Zuckerman and his team of 5 specialists reached the conclusion that Australopithecines were only an ordinary ape genus and were definitely not bipedal, although Zuckerman is an evolutionist himself. Correspondingly, Charles E. Oxnard, who is another evolutionist famous for his research on the subject, also likened the skeletal structure of Australopithecines to that of today's orangutans. The fact that Australopithecus cannot be considered an ancestor of man is also accepted by evolutionist sources. The well-known French magazine Science et Vie made this its cover story of its May 1999 issue. The story dealt with Lucy, the best-known fossil specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, under the title Adieu Lucy, Goodbye Lucy, and wrote of the need to remove Australopithecus from the human family tree. The article, based on the discovery of a new Australopithecus code number STW573, stated, "A new theory states that the genus Australopithecus is not the root of the human race. The results arrived at by the only woman authorized to examine STW573 are different from the normal theories regarding mankind's ancestors. This destroys the hominid family tree. Large primates considered the ancestors of man have been removed from the equation of this family tree. Australopithecus and Homo, human species, do not appear on the same branch. Man's direct ancestors are still waiting to be discovered." Homo habilis, the ape that was presented as human. The great similarity between the skeletal and cranial structures of Australopithecines and chimpanzees and the refutation of the claim that these creatures walked upright have caused great difficulty for evolutionist paleoanthropologists. The reason is that, according to the imaginary evolution scheme, Homo erectus comes from Australopithecus. As the genus name Homo, meaning man, implies, Homo erectus is a human species and its skeleton is straight. Its cranial capacity is twice as large as that of Australopithecus, a direct transition from Australopithecus, which is chimpanzee-like ape, to Homo erectus, which has a skeleton no different from today's man's, is out of the question even according to evolutionist theory. Therefore, links, that is, transitional forms, are needed. The concept of Homo habilis arose from this necessity. The classification of Homo habilis was put forward in the 1960s by the Leakeys, a family of fossil hunters. According to the Leakeys, this new species, which they classified as Homo habilis, had a relatively large cranial capacity, the ability to walk upright, and to use stone and wooden tools. Therefore, it could have been the ancestor of man. Australopithecus afarensis, an extinct ape. The first fossil found in Ethiopia, Hadar, which is to be supposed to belong to Australopithecus afarensis species AL2881 or Lucy. For a long time, evolutionists struggled to prove that Lucy could walk upright, but the latest research had definitely established that this animal was an ordinary ape with a bent stride. The Australopithecus afarensis AL333-105 fossil seen below belongs to a young member of this species. This is why the protrusion has not yet formed on his skull. I've always seen the skull of Australopithecus afarensis AL442 fossil, and below is the skull of a contemporary ape. The obvious similarity verifies that Australopithecus afarensis, that is, Lucy, is an ordinary ape species without any human-like features. The classification of Homo habilis was put forward in the 1960s by the Leakeys, a family of fossil hunters. According to the Leakeys, this new species, which they classified as Homo habilis, had a relatively large cranial capacity, the ability to walk upright, and to use stone and wooden tools. Therefore, it could have been the ancestor of man. New fossils of the same species unearthed in the late 1980s were to completely change this view. Some researchers, such as Bernard Wood and C. Loring Brace, who relied on these newly found fossils, stated that Homo habilis, which means skillful man, that is, man capable of using tools, should be classified as Australopithecus habilis, or skillful southern ape. Because Homo habilis had a lot of characteristics in common with Australopithecine apes. It had long arms, short legs, and an ape-like skeletal structure just like Australopithecus. Its fingers and toes were suitable for climbing. Their jaw was very similar to that of today's apes. Their 600 cc average cranial capacity is also an indication of the fact that they were apes. In short, Homo habilis, which was presented as a different species by some evolutionists, was in reality an ape species, just like all the other Australopithecines. Research carried out in the years since Wood and Brace's work has demonstrated that Homo habilis was indeed no different from Australopithecus. The skull and skeletal fossil OH62 found by Tim White showed that the species had a small cranial capacity as well as long arms and short legs, which enabled them to climb trees just like apes or they do. The detailed analysis conducted by American anthropologist Holly Smith in 1994 indicated that Homo habilis was not Homo. In other words, human at all, but rather unequivocally an ape. Speaking of the analysis she made on the teeth of Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo neanderthalensis, Smith stated the following: restricting analysis of fossils to specimens satisfying these criteria, patterns of dental development of gracile Australopithecines and Homo habilis remain classified with African apes. Those of Homo erectus and Neanderthals are classified with humans. Within the same year, Fred Spoor, Bernard Wood, and Franz Zonveld, all specialists on anatomy, reached a similar conclusion through a totally different method. This method was based on the comparative analysis of the semicircular canals in the inner ear of humans and apes, which provided for sustaining balance. Spoor, Wood, and Zonewald concluded that among the fossil hominids, the earliest species to demonstrate the modern human morphology is Homo erectus. In contrast, the semicircular canal dimensions in crania from southern Africa attributed to Australopithecus and Paranthropus resemble those of the extant great apes. Homo habilis, another extinct ape. For a long time, evolutionists argued that the creatures they called Homo habilis could walk upright. They thought that they had found a link stretching from ape to man. Yet the new Homo habilis fossils Tim White unearthed in 1986 and named as OH62 disproved this assertion. These fossil fragments showed that Homo habilis had long arms and short legs just like contemporary apes. This fossil put an end to the assertion proposing that Homo habilis was a bipedal, being able to walk upright. In truth, Homo habilis was nothing but another ape species. OH7 Homo habilis seen on the down left has been the fossil which best defined the mandibular features of the Homo habilis species. This mandible fossil has big incisory teeth. Its molar teeth are small, the shape of the mandible is square. All these qualities makes this mandible look very similar to that of today's apes. In other words, Homo habilis mandible once confirms that this being is actually an ape. Spoor, Wood and Zuniwald also studied a Homo habilis specimen, namely STW53, and found out that STW53 relied less on bipedal behavior than the Australopithecines. This meant that Homo habilis specimen was even more ape-like than the Australopithecus species. Thus they concluded that STW53 represents an unlikely intermediate between the morphologies seen in the Australopithecines and Homo erectus. This finding yielded two important results. Number one, fossil referred to as Homo habilis did not actually belong to the genus Homo, that is humans, but to that of Australopithecus, that is apes. And number second, both Homo habilis and Australopithecus were creatures that walked stupid forward. That is to say, they had the skeleton of an ape. They have no relation whatsoever to man. Homo rudolfensis, the face wrongly joined. The term Homo rudolfensis is the name given to a few fossil fragments unearthed in 1972. The species supposedly represented by this fossil was designated Homo rudolfensis because these fossil fragments were found in the vicinity of Lake Rudolph in Kenya. Most of the paleoanthropologists accepted that these fossils do not belong to a distinct species, but that the creature called Homo rudolfensis is in fact indistinguishable from Homo habilis. Richard Leakey, who unearthed the fossils, presented the skull designated KNMER 1470, which he said was 2.8 million years old, as the greatest discovery in the history of anthropology. According to Leakey, this creature, which had a small cranial capacity like that of Australopithecus together, with a face similar to that of present-day humans, was the missing link between Australopithecus and humans. Yet after a short while, it was realized that the human-like face of the KNMER 1470 skull, which frequently appeared on the covers of scientific journals and popular science magazines, was the result of the incorrect assembly of the skull fragments, which may have been deliberate. Professor Tim Bromage, who conducted studies on human facial anatomy, brought this to light by the help of computer simulations in 1992. And he stated, when it KNMER 1470 was first reconstructed, the face was fitted to the cranium in an almost vertical position. Much like the flat faces of modern humans, but recent studies of anatomical relationships show that in life the face must have jutted out considerably, creating an ape-like aspect, rather like the face of Australopithecus. The result of the analysis of the inner ear, there was no transition from ape to man. A comparative analysis of the semicircular canals in the inner ear in both humans and apes shows that the fossils long portrayed as the forerunners of human beings were all in fact ordinary apes. The species Australopithecus and Homo habilis had the inner ear canals of an ape, while Homo erectus had human ones. The evolutionist paleoanthropologist D. E. Cronin states the following on the matter of KNMER 1470. Its relatively robustly constructed face, flattest naso-alveolar clavus, recalling Australopithecine dished faces, low maximum cranial width on the temporals, strong canine juga and large molars, and indicated by remaining roots, are all relatively primitive traits which ally the specimen with members of the taxon Australopithecus africanus. C. Loring Brace from Michigan University came to the same conclusion as a result of the analysis he conducted on the jaw and tooth structure of the skull 1470. He reported that, and quote, from the size of the palate and the expansion of the area allotted to molar roots, it would appear that ER 1470 retained a fully Australopithecus sized face and dentition. Professor Alan Walker, a paleoanthropologist from Johns Hopkins University, who has done as much research on KNM ER 1470 as leaky, maintains that this creature should not be classified as a member of Homo, that is, as a human species, but rather should be placed in the Australopithecus genus. In summary, classifications like Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis, which are presented as transitional links between the Australopithecines and Homo erectus, are entirely imaginary. It has been confirmed by many researchers today that these creatures are members of the Australopithecus series. All of these anatomical features reveal that they are a species of ape. This fact has been further established by two evolutionist anthropologists, Bernard Wood and Mark Collard, whose research was published in 1999 in Science magazine. Wood and Collard explained that the Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, that is skull 1470 texts, are imaginary, and that the fossils assigned to this category should be attributed to the genus Australopithecus. End quote. More recently, fossil species have been assigned to Homo on the basis of absolute brain size, inferences about language ability and hand function, and retrodictions about their ability to fashion stone tools. With only a few exceptions, the definition and use of the genus within human evolution and the demarcation of Homo have been treated as if they are unproblematic. But recent data, fresh interpretations of the existing evidence, and the limitations of the paleoanthropological record invalidate existing criteria for attributing taxa to Homo. In practice, fossil hominin species are assigned to Homo on the basis of one or more out of four criteria. It is now evident, however, that none of these criteria is satisfactory. The cerebral Rubicon is problematic because absolute cranial capacity is of questionable biological significance. Likewise, there is compelling evidence that language function cannot be reliably inferred from the gross appearance of the brain, and that the language-related parts of the brain are not as well localized as early studies had implied. In other words, with the hypodings of Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis assigned to it, the genus Homo is not a good genus. The Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis should be removed from Homo. The obvious taxonomic alternative, which is to transfer one or both of the taxa to one of the existing early hominin genera, is not without problems. But we recommend that for the time being, both Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis should be transferred to the genus Australopithecus. The conclusion of Wood and Collard corroborates the conclusion we have maintained here. Primitive human ancestors do not exist in history. Creatures that are alleged to be so are actually apes that ought to be assigned to the genus Australopithecus. The fossil record shows that there is no evolutionary link between these extinct apes and Homo, that is, human species, that certainly appears in the fossil record. Homo erectus, a real human race. Homo erectus means upright man. All the fossils included in this species belong to particular human races. Since most of the Homo erectus fossils do not have a common characteristic, it is quite hard to define these men according to their skulls. This is the reason why different evolutionist researchers have made various classifications and designations. Above left is seen a skull which was found in Kubifora, Africa in 1975, which may generally define Homo erectus. Above right is a skull, Homo ergaster, KNM ER 3733, which has the obscurities in question. The cranial capacities of all these diverse Homo erectus fossils surge between 900 to 1100 cc. These figures are within the limits of the contemporary human cranial capacity. KNMWT 15,000 or Turkana child skeleton on the right is probably the oldest and the most complete human fossil ever found. Research made on this fossil, which is said to be 1.6 million year old, shows that this belongs to a 12-year-old child who would become around 1.80 meter tall if he reached adolescence. This fossil, which very much resembled to the Neanderthal race, is one of the most remarkable evidence in validating the story of humans' evolution. The evolutionist Donald Johnson describes this fossil as follows. He was tall and skinny. His body shape and the proportion of his limbs were the same as the current equator Africans. The sizes of his limbs totally matched with that of the current white North American adults. Donald C. Johnson and M. A. Eddy Lucy, The Beginnings of Humankind, New York, Simon and Schuster, 1981. Homo erectus and thereafter human beings. According to the fanciful scheme suggested by evolutionists, the internal evolution of the Homo genus is as follows. First, Homo erectus, then so-called archaic Homo sapiens and the Neanderthal man, and finally Cro-Magnon man, Homo sapiens sapiens. However, all these classifications are really only variations and unique races in the human family. The difference between them is no greater than the difference between an Inuit and an African or a pygmy and a European. Let us first examine Homo erectus, which is referred to as the most primitive human species. As the name implies, Homo erectus means man who walks upright. Evolutionists have had to separate these fossils from earlier ones by adding the qualification of erectness, because all the available Homo erectus fossils are straight to an extent not observed in any of the Australopithecines or so-called Homo habilis specimens. There is no difference between the postcranial skeleton of today's man and that of Homo erectus. The primary reason for evolutionists defining Homo erectus as primitive is the cranial capacity of its skull, that is 900 to 1100 cc, which is smaller than the average man of our day, and its thick eyebrow projections. However, there are many people living today in the world who have the same cranial capacity as Homo erectus. Pygmies, for instance, and other races have protruding eyebrows, native Australians, for instance. It is a commonly agreed upon fact that differences in cranial capacity do not necessarily denote differences in intelligence or abilities. Intelligence depends on the internal organization of the brain rather than on its volume. 700,000-year-old mariners. Ancient mariners. Early humans were much smarter than we expected. News published in New Scientist on March 14, 1998. Early humans were much smarter than we suspected. Tells us that the humans called Homo erectus by evolutionists were practicing seamanship 700,000 years ago. These humans, who had enough knowledge and technology to build a vessel and possess a culture that made use of sea transport, can hardly be called primitive. The fossils that have made Homo erectus known to the entire world are those of Peking man and Java man in Asia. However, in time it was realized that these two fossils are not reliable. Peking man consists of some elements made of plaster whose originals have been lost, and Java man is composed of a skull fragment plus a pelvic bone that was found meters away from it, with no indication that these belong to the same creature. This is why the Homo erectus fossils found in Africa have gained such increasing importance. It should also be noted that some of the fossils said to be Homo erectus were included under a second species named Homo ergaster by some evolutionists. There is disagreement among the experts on this issue. We will treat all these fossils under the classification of Homo erectus. The most famous of the Homo erectus specimens found in Africa is the fossil of Nericotome Homo erectus, or the Turkana boy, which was found near Lake Turkana in Kenya. It is confirmed that the fossil was that of a 12-year-old boy who would have been 1.83 meters tall in adolescence. The upright skeletal structure of the fossil is no different from that of contemporary man. The American paleoanthropologist Alan Walker said that he doubted that the average pathologist could tell the difference between the fossil skeleton and that of a modern human. Concerning the skull, Walker wrote that he laughed when he saw it because it looked so much like a Neanderthal. As we will see in the next chapter, Neanderthals are a modern human race. Therefore, Homo erectus is also a modern human race. Even the evolutionist Richard Leakey states that the differences between Homo erectus and modern man are no more than racial variants. One would see differences in the shape of the skull, in the degree of protrusion of the face, the robustness of the brows, and so on. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans. Such biological variation arises when populations are geographically separated from each other for significant lengths of time. Professor William Laughlin from the University of Connecticut made extensive anatomical examinations of Inuits and the people living on the Aleut Islands, and noticed that these people were extraordinarily similar to Homo erectus. The conclusion Laughlin arrived at was that all these distinct races were in fact different races of Homo sapiens, today's man. When we consider the vast differences that exist between remote groups such as Eskimos and Bushmen who are known to belong to the single species of Homo sapiens, it seems justifiable to conclude that Sinanthropus, an erectus specimen, belongs within this same diverse species. It is now a more pronounced fact in the scientific community that Homo erectus is a superfluous taxon, and that fossils assigned to the Homo erectus class are actually not so different from Homo sapiens as to be considered a different species. In American Scientist, the discussions over this issue and the result of a conference held on the subject in 2000 were summarized in this way. Most of the participants at the Seckenberg conference got drawn into a flaming debate over the taxonomic status of Homo erectus started by Milford Wolpoff of the University of Michigan, Alan Thorne of the University of Canberra and their colleagues. They argued forcefully that Homo erectus had no validity as a species and should be eliminated altogether. All members of the genus Homo from about 2 million years ago to the present were one highly variable, widely spread species. Homo sapiens with no natural breaks or subdivisions, the subject of the conference, Homo erectus didn't exist. The conclusion reached by the scientists defending the above mentioned thesis can be summarized as Homo erectus is not a different species from Homo sapiens, but rather a race within Homo sapiens. On the other hand, there is a huge gap between Homo erectus, a human race, and the apes that preceded Homo erectus in the human evolution scenario. That is, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo rudolfensis. This means that the first man appeared in the fossil record suddenly and without any prior evolutionary history. This is the most clear indication of their being created. Yet admitting this fact is totally against the dogmatic philosophy and ideology of evolutionists. As a result, they try to portray Homo erectus, a truly human race, as a half-ape creature. In their Homo erectus reconstructions, they tenaciously draw simian features. On the other hand, with similar drawings methods, they humanize apes like Australopithecus or Homo habilis. With this method, they seek to approximate apes and human beings and close the gap between these two distinct living classes. Neanderthals. Neanderthals were human beings who suddenly appeared 1 lakh years ago in Europe and who disappeared or were assimilated by mixing with other races quietly but quickly 35,000 years ago. Their only difference from man of our day is that their skeletons are more robust and their cranial capacity is slightly bigger. Neanderthals were a human race, a fact which is admitted by almost everybody. Today, evolutionists have tried very hard to present them as a primitive species, yet all the findings indicate that they were no different from a robust man walking on the street today. A prominent authority on the subject, Eric Trinkas, a paleoanthropologist from New Mexico University, writes, "Detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, and linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. Many contemporary researchers define Neanderthal man as a subspecies of present-day man and call him Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. The findings testify that Neanderthals buried their dead, fashioned musical instruments, and had cultural affinities with the Homo sapiens living during the same period. To put it precisely, Neanderthals are a robust human race that simply disappeared in time."